Hello, classmates. My name is Preston Lewis, and I'd like to share a scripture from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verses 22 through 25. And I'll be reading from the NIV translation. And the subtitle is Jesus Calms the Storm. One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and they set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A great squall came down on the lake, so that the boat was being swamped and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." He got up, rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." The word of the Lord. Well, this is a very short scripture that offers a very powerful message without a lot of detail. I believe that when this was written, detail on the story was certainly not necessary, but it kind of helps us in our reading and understanding. And by placing us there that day, what will we see and experience as we were there with Jesus the day that he was on the boat with the disciples? Well, there are some things we have to assume that maybe this was a ferry boat. We know it was a sailboat because the scripture says that they sailed. But was it a ferry boat, maybe taking other passengers other than the crew? We don't know that. But we do know that the lake that was being referenced here is the Sea of Galilee. And in my mind, a lake is oftentimes not that big. You can walk around faster than you can sail across. But in this case, the Sea of Galilee happens to be 13 miles across with 8 miles wide, surrounded by some pretty rugged terrain on three sides. So the most practical way to go across to another part of the region would be to take a boat and sail across. Well, as I mentioned, there is no doubt a small crew that were running the operation of the boat. Uh, we can imagine and also assume that they were seasoned sailors because this was no doubt their vocation, their jobs. And as was also with some of the disciples, as you know. Uh, they were no strangers to the sea or boats for that matter. You know, I used to live on an island myself, and being around the sea offered a lot of great experiences and the sights and the sounds, even the smells. And I had an intercoastal waterway right in the backyard, and as the tide would come in, and then it would go out, what the tide brought in and would leave us was maybe some rotting seagrass, maybe the carcass of a dead fish that was left over from some hungry seagull. But in the case of Galilee, I'm sure it wasn't much different. The region was also very hot for much of the year, and it was the seashore, so all the same familiar smells of the seashore were there, the rotting seagrass, maybe rotting fish as well, and also being the day before antiperspirants, as those crew members and disciples all gathered up on the boat, there was another addition or to that spectrum of smell. Well, this day was perhaps no different rather than any other day for the disciples, for the men on the boat who were running the boat, maybe some passengers if that were the case. So they were loading the boat, getting on, whether they stepped on dry from a dry dock onto the boat or waded out through the water to get to the boat, we don't know. But what we do know, the boat was a sailboat and it sailed. And when you talk about a sailboat, you hear things and see things. As the sail is lifted into place, the captain may be barking some orders to tie off a rope here, tie off a rope there as he mans the tiller and moving from one side of the lake to the other. We don't know if they're going a direct route with the wind or having to do a tacking maneuver, which is back and forth to go into the wind. We're not sure, but we do know that ahead of them lied maybe a cloud bank. Well, Jesus made his way to the back, immediately fell asleep. And we can imagine that because of the rocking and the pitching of the boat, it helped to lull Jesus into a very deep sleep, and with a cool breeze blowing. And you can imagine every now and then the clouds would block out the sun, and it would become very cool suddenly and feel good. And and this is probably very enjoyable for the crew as well as the passengers. Some of the conversation on the deck may be about family or current events, fishing, no doubt, sharing stories. But again, as I mentioned, there was a storm here. It was a squall, and a squall, by definition, is a storm that happens very suddenly, and a cloud bank from forming maybe when the horizon was now right on them. And typically, squalls announce themselves with swells in the water, which would raise a boat up and then drop it back down. And so the boat would perhaps even creak even louder. The wind would whip the sails even more. And this is evidence that something is about to happen. Um, on the deck, no doubt, there were people who were becoming a little concerned with the condition. They didn't have the weather app or the Weather Channel app on their iPhone back in the day. Doppler radar wasn't a thing. And so for them to know what was about to happen would be impossible, especially when you have a storm suddenly appear. Well, the waves began to pick up, and maybe the boat may have been overloaded a little bit, and the water line was a little higher than it should have been. But either way, waves began to lap over the sides of the boat and fill the boat. The scripture tells us it was being swamped, which means that the water level outside the boat and the inside of the boat are roughly the same, so you lose buoyancy and you're subject to sinking at that point in time. Well, I'm sure that after maybe a wave or two, and the soaked disciples, who were very panicked at that time, thought it'd be a good time to wake up Jesus. And considering they were panicked, uh, waking him up may have consisted of shaking him and yelling into his ear, "Master, Master, we're going to drown. Maybe save us." And so Jesus at that point in time, I imagine, was very uh, upset. Have you ever been awakened by out of a sound sleep by someone yelling uh, and panicked? You're jarred out of a sleep. But I'm thinking, in the case of Jesus, he could have easily not even opened his eyes and said, "Peace, be still," or "Waves, cease," "Wind, stop," and everything was fine. However, he didn't do that. He decided to stand up, address the sea and address the wind, and tell it to be still, calm down, silence. And suddenly everything became still. Jesus turned and maybe took a few steps back to where he was laying down. He may or may not have even looked at his disciples, but he said, "Where is your faith?" So I imagine there was some shock. There were people who didn't really believe what they just witnessed. That this man, as they murmured among themselves, this man, who can he be? That he would even command the sea and the wind, and it listened to him or obey him, as the NIV explains. Well, this was my attempt at drafting a narrative that kind of described the experience today with Jesus, and this is the end.